Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Tom from Data Protection World Forum, and the topic for today's webinar is Give Back Control, Empower the Consumer to Enable Data Privacy Rights Compliance. And I'd like to introduce the host for this session, David Harris, who is co-founder at Manetu. Over to you, David.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I have a 30-year history in regulation. I have had the pleasure of both being a regulator myself. I've run a couple of US-based stock exchanges. About 5 years ago, I started focusing on emerging technologies, and it seems that all roads led to data. And regulation started to rear its head. And so what we wanted to do today, and I'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, but essentially give you a view from the legal side of where the regulations are and where they're probably going, give you a sense of the operational issues that companies are facing.
I am Joe McClendon. I am a former IT professional, and I have since retrained as an attorney. I am currently a senior associate attorney with the law firm K&L Gates. I spend a lot of my time lately helping clients with GDPR and CCPA, and I'm very happy to be here to explore this area of the law with you guys today.
Excellent. Steve?
My background is Data Protection Officer and Chief Information Security Officer. I've been in various different organizations over the last 25 years, focused the first part of my career on cybersecurity and the last 10 years on data privacy. Worked for a number of large, well-known organizations, which I'll come on to later. So I've really had my fair share of GDPR. I've got scars to prove it. And latterly, I've set up my own organization here based in London.
Hello, everyone. I am the co-founder and CEO of Manetu. And prior to that, I was the global chief technology architect for State Street Bank. And before that, I was the global chief innovation officer for the London Stock Exchange Group. We have been working on data privacy issues for many years.
Moiz and I worked together at the London Stock Exchange Group. One of the first issues we dealt with, companies had no idea where their data was. The customer data resides in a lot of different data stores. One customer has one email, another customer, the same customer has a different email. So the visibility of who the customer was very, very difficult. And then underlying all of this is always that issue, do customers really understand what a company is doing with their business? Regulation came along, and that was really the catalyst for us to start Manetu, because we were thinking about trying to deal with those problems, but now that there's a regulatory catalyst that's forcing everybody to deal with these problems, and Moiz will show you, but fundamentally what Manetu does is it discovers data, it maps that data into a highly, highly secure platform where an identity is essentially collapsed into a single identity. So you get a consolidated view of the consumer. And then building from what we found at other places, having the consumer actually curate their data in terms of both keeping it up to date, but also controlling it for regulatory purposes, became a very important part of what Manetu has become. And I imagine as companies grapple with data and data privacy, they're bringing in their compliance and their legal departments. And so, Joe, do you want to give us a quick update on where the world stands and where you see it going?
We'll start with just a quick rundown on where we are globally in terms of privacy and data protection legislation to really set the stage for the rest of today's conversation. So beginning with the United States, in the last couple of years, we saw 42 states introduce 240 bills or resolutions regarding privacy and information security. 28 states enacted new laws. All 50 states now have a personal data breach notification law. In terms of significant legislation that was passed, obviously we have California with the CCPA. Nevada actually passed a law. It's called an act relating to internet privacy. It gives consumers the ability to opt out of a website or online service operator from selling their personal information. We also saw the New York SHIELD Act come into play. The SHIELD Act amended New York's data breach notification law, and notably broadened the definition of private information to include biometric information, as well as a consumer's email username and password, and also account or credit card number by itself, independent of a PIN or password. So that's a big change. We have a bigger territorial scope with the SHIELD Act, and then also it added an obligation for businesses to adopt reasonable safeguards to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of private information. As far as legislation that's in the works, so these are bills that have been introduced but not yet passed. Washington State has one cooking that aligns with GDPR, and that one's currently sitting with the State House. Illinois has a CCPA-inspired law that's currently sitting with the State Senate. New Hampshire has a CCPA but worse law sitting in committee right now, and then same with Pennsylvania. They have a CCPA-esque law that is actually worse than CCPA in terms of what it protects, what it does, how it's enforced. GDPR is generally viewed as a positive measure for privacy protection. Other notable privacy laws and issues that we're looking at is that the UK, post-Brexit, is harmonized with GDPR. Iceland and Norway have accepted GDPR. Brazil, India, New Zealand, and China have all passed privacy laws in the last 3 or so years. So globally, we're moving forward. But overall, the state of the privacy and data protection framework on a global scale is moving in the direction of GDPR and GDPR-like laws. Consumers are being given more access and control to their personal information through these laws. So, looking forward at the pertinent topics for today's conversation, GDPR and CCPA. Before GDPR, there were 27 versions of the Data Protection Directive, so understandably that can be confusing. Also note that the Data Protection Directive, or the Data Protection Directive, was passed in 1995. So that was a 20-year-old law that was passed at the dawn of the internet that's governing today's technologies and data processing. We've come a long way since we were making our first websites on GeoCities and Tripod. So it was important that the law was updated to move into the 21st century. So looking at these broadly, CCPA models GDPR in several ways, but it shouldn't be considered America's GDPR or GDPR light. Even though there are some overlap areas in regards to how broad it is and the broad definition of personal data and differentiating between controllers and processors and businesses and service providers, overall, these are very different laws and they should be treated as such. GDPR establishes a framework for restricting personal data processing from the outset, whereas CCPA is still operationally an opt-out style framework. Each of these laws created new obligations for companies that are collecting and processing personal information from consumers, which we can see here on the slide. But today we're going to focus on data subject access requests, or DSARs. So a DSAR is shorthand for all of the rights a data subject or a consumer has under the respective law. The right to access, which is essentially the right to know what information a company has about you, what they're doing with it, and who they're sharing it with. The right to rectification, or the right to fix that information they have about you. The right to erasure, which is the right to be forgotten. The right to restriction, the right to stop processing under certain circumstances, but the company is still allowed to store that information about you. The right to data portability, which is the right to get a copy of the information they have so you can take it somewhere else. The right to object, which is the right to object to how personal data is being processed unless the company has an overriding reason to continue that processing. And then this is really GDPR specific, but the right to not be subject to automated decision making, which essentially is just the right to not have a computer make a decision about you without human intervention. And then finally, the right to opt out of selling personal information. This is the ability for the consumer to say, I don't want you to sell my personal information to another company, and you can withdraw your consent to that. So you can see some overlap with some of the DSAR categories, but for the most part, each law gives a different set of rights to their constituents. You have 30 days to respond to a DSAR under GDPR and 45 days under CCPA, and that timer begins when you receive the DSAR. These rights are not 100% absolute. If a data subject wants to have their personal data deleted, the company can refuse the request if the company has an overriding reason to retain that information. So compliance with law is a big one. And then another one could be that company is involved in litigation and that personal data is somehow included in that litigation. So they'll need to keep it in order to follow along with legal obligations. To be clear, and this is something that we're going to talk about over the course of this presentation, these are not easy obligations to comply with. If you don't have a data map to track the flows of personal data through your company or a data inventory to track exactly what personal data you have about your consumers, you won't be able to comply with these obligations. And likewise, if you don't have policies in place to track how you receive DSARs and manage them once they're in your system, you won't be able to respond within the timeframes that have been allotted. We've all heard about how high the fines are and what the issues can be for noncompliance under these laws. GDPR, the fines can range from the greater of 4% of the global turnover for your company or 20 million euros. And for CCPA, the fines can range from $2,500 to $7,500 for each violation. So those are incentives to not be on the wrong side of these. In my experience, DSARs are the most difficult pieces of these regulations to comply with, and it's because most companies don't have a handle on what data they have or how they're using it. Policies and trainings are the minimum steps a company should take to prepare itself for responding to a DSAR. Some of my clients even use third-party software to manage DSARs like they would like an IT support ticket. But like I noted, the companies that struggle the most with DSARs are the companies that haven't done data mapping or data inventory exercises, and they have no idea what information they have, how they're using it, or how long they're storing it, or who they're sharing it with. And that's how companies are getting in trouble under these laws and coming under scrutiny when they're unable to respond to a DSAR in a timely manner or give the required amount of information.
There's 99 articles in GDPR and a similar number of recitals. That's just for the framework, and then you have all of the different data protection authorities around Europe producing their guidance on how this should be interpreted and how it should be implemented. So it's been tough. And I was the data protection officer for Unilever and then subsequently for John Lewis Partnership, which is a major retailer here in the UK with over 85,000 staff. So trying to communicate so elegantly, Joe, I think if we'd had you a couple of years ago, that would have been incredibly helpful. I think what Joe has also alluded to is there's some real operational issues here that just time and time again, in my experience now as a partner at Privacy Culture, just keeps coming to bear. And that is things you mentioned about the DSARs, but also around the lawful basis by which they process the data, which if you haven't done your data inventory, your data mapping, and you don't understand the data journeys, the way that the customers come in across multiple different channels, then you really are going to come unstuck when it comes to documenting Article 30 requirements, which is basically the what's called the records of processing activities. In other words, what's the lawful basis by which you're processing this data? And there are 6 lawful bases of which you can rely on. Typically, it's consent or contract or legitimate interest. But that has to be understood and documented if the regulator comes knocking. And I can assure you that the regulators, the Spanish are very, in fact, I could list nearly all of them, including our very own ICO here in the UK. But some of the more sort of aggressive regulators, if you like, are really going in on the nuances of non-regulatory compliance. They're fining companies. Experian, for example, in Spain, was recently fined for not having correct retention schedules in place when a DSAR request had come in, and the company had replied saying, "I'm sorry, it's excessive and it's too hard because it's in format. So we're not going to reply to it." Well, the Spanish Data Protection Authority didn't think that was upholding the rights of that individual and subsequently fined them. So it is really happening, and we're really feeling it. And I'm connected with a number of DPOs across Europe, and I can tell you firsthand that it's a little bit of a firefight.
What we're finding when we talk with people around DSARs is frankly just very practical issues. Practical issue one, which I feel is going to be a very large issue going forward, is making sure that the person who's asking for their data is actually that person. We've talked with a lot of customers on the Manetu side, and just that process of making sure that, in fact, it's David Harris who's asking for his data is time-consuming and expensive.
David, I'll just explain very briefly the process that we went through at John Lewis.
Please. I was dancing, my friend.
Generally speaking, there's 8 steps to this process, but I can tell you that the hardest part of any DSAR process is actually just the simple steps of receiving those requests and being able to differentiate ones from, say, a complaint or a rectification. And very often our call centers, we had 6 call centers, we were losing DSARs because the calls were coming in. And don't forget, you can make your DSAR request verbally, but the calls were coming in and the emails were being filtered. And of course, our staff were missing some of those key elements of, well, actually hidden in this complaint is a DSAR request, or it could be the right to be forgotten, or it could have just been a right to rectification. And we, I don't mind saying this, we had a lot of complaints that got upheld and were investigated by the regulator, the ICO. So it was an incredibly hard thing to do. And I'll come on to the operational challenges. The first step is the user submits that request. The next step is to check and validate, if you like, that you're not being spammed. It's not some sort of malicious attack or something like that. And given that I was responsible for the cybersecurity at the same time, this was a big concern for us. Could it be used as, in effect, a denial of service attack? Because you could put multiple requests in, thus causing our call centers and our back office processing facilities to jam up, if you like. So the user identification was a big challenge. That was operationally a really useful thing to delay the process, to allow us time to assimilate some of the information by going back to the clients, customers, and saying, please can you validate who you are? And one of the things which was abolished under this was we used to charge, and it was only a nominal amount, but it did sort out the people that were just, if you like, complaining and using it as a thing, from the people who genuinely wanted to see through a subject access request. And of course, when that was abolished, we had no way of reclaiming that. The other challenge, as you can see here, is the internal requests. So submitting those and then making sure you've got a response. Bear in mind, the clock is ticking here. And you're talking about multiple functions, multiple departments that these requests can come in from. You've got people who can walk into shops, people that can connect via the social media, or you've got email and white snail mail. So you've got all these different channels all coming at you, and you've got to somehow consistently pull all of that together and have the right information and go after the right data sets. You've also then got to push that data, that report, to your portal, and then obviously all of this needs to be captured from a compliance perspective. And this was particularly challenging when we had complaints that were upheld by our regulator, and we had to then do a thorough investigation as to why the first line support hadn't actually fulfilled this customer's requirements. And being the DPO, there's a big part of being a data protection officer, which is about being independent and being able to think very quite rightly about protecting the rights and freedoms of the individual. So if you like, we're the sort of vanguard for those individual rights. So when you're going up against your own internal business, sometimes the DPO or the Data Protection Office or Privacy Office can be a very lonely place. Sometimes we got requests from customers that we weren't on our records, and we couldn't work out why for some time. And that's the kind of challenge that you have when a business has been around for 100 years, has accumulated vast quantities of data in various different data sets, and then suddenly a customer pops out of the woodwork years later and says, oh, I'd like my right to be forgotten under GDPR. And you've got to go and track and trace, if you like, that particular individual to make sure you upheld their rights all within 30 days, which from experience, and I have scars to prove it, is incredibly challenging. Obviously, when I was interim DPO for the Bank of England, this was the big one where really we started from the very outset with a blank piece of paper and sat down, and I created a framework of all those requirements similar to the ones that Joe had mentioned earlier, and then we sort of worked backwards to how we were going to fulfill those. We already had a level of DSAR requests. We had a consistent flow of data requests, I would say in the region of about 10 a week from our internal staff, and let's be honest, typically these were disgruntled employees, some sort of, litigation or some complaint, and, they were requesting the information to help their case, whatever the situation. What we quickly realized was that we would have to create a much larger capability for our 15 million customers so that our customer services functions, which included 6 call centers, were able to take this process, end-to-end process. I wish we'd had tools like yours. We basically had to create manual processes for a lot of this. And I dare say the automation side of that would have made things a whole lot easier. But there you go, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I think really apart from all the other legal obligations of data mapping and then the fulfillment of those, I think the hardest part of this was really around just getting that operationalized in both our customer services teams and in our HR teams, because that's what we made as a strategic decision, was to move that capability to our in-house teams, because let's face it, they were better placed to deal with customers or be it those internal employees, the HR department, or the customer services to deal with our customers' SARs, DSARs coming through.
The data privacy person, you're kind of the conscience of the company, right?
That's right.
And one of the things that I found when I started fooling around with data is that they're really, when you talked about the ethics of using data, people thought you were out of your mind. And so, so the data privacy officer, the regulators did not create these laws to give companies a headache. They created the laws to make it easy for customers to understand. So to me, the easiest and best and most effective way to get customers to trust you and your use of the data is your ability to quickly respond to their requests, right? You cannot be running around saying, I don't know where your data is. That does not inspire confidence.
I was just going to say, it's also quite costly as well, because we did some analysis to work out how much time each request was taking per individual, and if you start to work that out, our headcount for dealing with these at its peak, and we did see a wave when GDPR went live. And then that bottomed out, but it was still 4 or 5 times higher than when we went in. But we did have to train up to 30 people to who were going to be responsible for managing this. So that was an entire department, an entire function that had to be created in order to fulfill these, and the cost of not only the training but the cost of that staff is considerable. So I think any solution that can help with the effectiveness and efficiency has got to be seriously considered by any size organization. If you're a single individual DPO representing a small business, you would get lost in a single DSAR. The point about timestamping and making sure that you've captured what you needed is absolutely critical when it comes to providing the chronology of evidence that you've responded to that client, or you've turned that customer, away based on, or that example of the Spanish example where they said it was excessive because it was hard to get to because it was unstructured data in email. You've got to be able to have what we call here, and certainly in our company, a defensible position. The role of the DPO is to struggle to be that balance, if you like, between the risks facing the business, the risk of that occurring, and then obviously the protection of those individual rights. And that's why it's a conflict. So anything that can be done to ease the privacy office, to help them be more effective, more efficient, because penultimately we want to be helping the business look at privacy by design, thinking about how this can be embedded into software or into processes right at the outset. And I think that's the fundamental shift that GDPR has been live for 2 years now. The enforcement date went live for 2 years. And what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in the way that people perceive organizations that don't have a really robust, strong, ethical approach towards data privacy.
That's perfect. Well, look, that is a perfect lead into Moiz.
As Steve mentioned, right, one of the biggest challenges that organizations have is their data is scattered throughout the organization in disparate data sources. So there are many target systems which contain privacy information on a particular data subject. And how you manage that and discover that are the challenges that Manetu really solves. So I'll walk you guys through a very quick demonstration of our capabilities, which hopefully point to some of the things that we all heard Steve and Joe mention. So what you see over here is one particular target system, which is Salesforce. Now, an organization can have their data scattered through, like I had mentioned, multiple target systems, Salesforce, Oracle, other CRMs, or structured as in databases, or unstructured data sources. Unstructured data sources could be things along the lines of your cloud data storage, your network drives where you have PDF files and Excel files and Word files that contain PII information. And according to these regulations, you actually have to provide the client, the consumer, with specific information regarding where you hold their data, what type of data you hold on the consumer. If they ask to revoke that data, you have to go into all of those systems and actually be able to revoke that data. So I'm showing you one such data source, which is Salesforce, where you can see that for a particular consumer, you're holding different types of information under their contact schema. Their email addresses, their assistant's name, number, and additional information. What Manetu does is provide this service provider the ability to log into a control plane, a control system. We give them the ability to do some of the basic functions that we spoke of. So over here, you'll see that this particular organization has the ability to connect into multiple connectors. What this particular connector allows you to do is be able to map a schema, be able to run machine learning algorithms against that particular target system, and be able to see not only which particular components of the schema you want to, which are PII, the machine learning algorithms give you additional information as to additional fields where PII data may be hiding. So as per Steve, it takes a long time to go out and collect and aggregate the data that you're looking to aggregate. In this particular scenario, the administrator has the ability to go out, discover, and aggregate all of this data in one place, where the Manetu control plane acts as the single source of truth for all of this aggregated data. You also have the ability to look at reports. These reports can be generated on a geographic basis. They can be generated on any number of search criteria that you would like to define. Remember where Steve said one of the first things that GDPR and CCPA allow a consumer the right to know what data a company holds on them. Traditionally, to collect that data and give that data back to the consumer, it takes hours of processing time. In the Manetu system, a consumer, once they have registered and you authenticate them appropriately, the consumer can come in and directly see what data an organization holds on them. And they can see what policies they are subjected to under this organization for the data sharing or other policies of how the organization leverages that consumer data. The consumer has the ability to look at that directly. The consumer can actually consent or not consent to those policies directly from their own portal. And the consumer, as per GDPR and CCPA, where the consumer has the right to edit and the consumer has the right to revoke data, has the ability to directly edit data on any given attribute that this organization holds on them. So if the consumer wanted to change their assistant's name from Johnny Cash to J Cash, they have the ability to do that. The organization has a policy engine that allows them to ensure that only certain attributes are changed per the organizational policies. But if the organization allows the consumer to change these attributes, you will notice that within the organizational data, that particular field will change almost instantaneously, where you can see that that data changed from Johnny Cash to J Cash. Not only did this change occur within the control system, we keep track of exactly where these attributes reside within the organization, and we can update those attributes within the organization, such as if we were to go back here and refresh our window within Salesforce, the organization does not need to go back into their target system and manage that data. Manetu control plane actually ends up acting as a master data repository of all aggregated data across multiple control planes. And it also acts as a regulatory vault. When a consumer makes a change within the system, we keep track of that change within a blockchain-like architecture. And you can see that the organization has the ability as a super admin to go in and see who changed what data, when they made that change, and what change occurred. So, David, I'll hand this back to you, but one of the main things that I would like to highlight is that the Manetu control plane and the system allows you to, first of all, discover data that in disparate data sources across an enterprise, aggregate that data into a single control plane, and then give self-service rights to the appropriate consumers on their own data, such that the organization ends up not carrying the burden of needing to go into multiple places and edit that data as per the regulations require them to. David?
Hey, Moiz, we got a question about the security of our platform.
We have actually incorporated many different security principles, such as, first of all, how do you, in no uncertain terms, identify a particular entity who is operating on the platform? And in order to do that, we incorporate principles such as multi-factor authentication, biometric authentication, as well as post-quantum key distribution capabilities to be able to identify a operator on our platform in no uncertain terms. So we are happy to really manage some of these questions offline, but we do take security and data privacy extremely seriously, and we're leveraging mechanisms which are state-of-the-art for any organization on the planet today.
So, Tom, I'm going to turn it to you.
Brilliant. I'd like to thank our panelists for that really insightful session, and to our audience for joining us today. We hope you've gained a lot from that, and we hope to speak to you again soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing that. Bye, guys.
Thanks, David.